Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. This is a remix episode. I spoke with two prominent computer scientists who grew up in Egypt and Lebanon in different decades. The first, Amr El-Abadi, now a computer science professor at UC Santa Barbara in the US, grew up in Egypt and Lebanon in the 1960s and 70s, finishing his bachelor's in 1980 in Egypt before he moved to the US. The second narrator, Fadl Adib, now a computer science professor at MIT in the US. He grew up in Lebanon in the 1990s and 2000s and finished his bachelor's in 2011 in Lebanon before he moved to the US. You can hear the full interviews with these distinguished computer scientists in the Middle East Entrepreneurs episode, that's episode 9, and their full interviews in episodes 11 and 12, episode 11 for Fadl Adib and episode 12 for Amr El-Abadi. All these are available on our website and on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. And the episode guide for this remix episode, like all other episodes, is available on our website, csimmigrant.org. Amr El-Abadi, professor of computer science at UC Santa Barbara, is up next. He grew up in Egypt. You also spent 3 years in Lebanon in the late 1960s. Tell us a little bit about why you went to Lebanon and how was your experience there and how was it different from growing up in Egypt?
So because my parents were professors in Alexandria University, there was a strong connection between Alexandria University and the Arab University of Beirut, which is an Arab university that catered to mainly diverse students who couldn't go to the private schools in Beirut. And so many of the students, so they went there for 3 years to teach there. And many of the students were actually Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. And one of my vivid recollections from that period was the 67 war, where there was a significant war between the Arabs and Israel, basically Egypt, Syria, and Jordan and Israel. And at the time, many of the students I remember were from the West Bank, and the war was 5th of June, so it was in June, and many of the students had come to take the exams, and then the war happened and they were cut from their families. So I remember my parents having them over at our house and just talking and eating together and stuff. So it was a period of turmoil and uncertainty, and I saw all that, and it kind of has affected my outlook on life. And Lebanon is a much more open society compared to Egypt. There's a lot of enjoyment, outdoors activities and things. The nature is so different from Egypt. Egypt is desert, flat, and everything, any green that you see in traditional Egypt, unless you really go far, is man-made, is fields and stuff. In Lebanon, you have mountains, you have snow. I'd never seen snow before. You have rivers, small rivers that are flowing. In Egypt, there's one big river, the Nile, and it dominates kind of. So it's a very different type of environment. and very diverse, extremely diverse. You meet people of so many different kinds. So in addition to the Palestinians, you have Kurds, you have Armenians, you have you have diversity of Christian sects as well as Muslim sects. So you learn, when I grew up in Egypt, you only think of Muslims as Muslims and you don't think of anything else. It turns out we are Sunnis while there are Shia. In Egypt, I should have mentioned earlier, there are both Christians and Muslims. The majority is Muslim, but there is a significant minority of Coptic Christian Egyptians.
So you mentioned that the war that happened in Lebanon while you were there has affected your outlook in life. Can you say a little bit how that has affected your outlook in life?
So, I mean, I tend to understand that there are cataclysmic problems that happen in the world, wars, for example, in particular, and they affect the everyday life of individuals, whether it is to study, whether it's to take even exams becomes a challenge in these circumstances. So one has to understand that there are settings where there are deep challenges that are outside of our control in a way. I also there was another war, the 73. So my childhood was affected by several of these serious wars. So in Egypt in 73, I was in high school at the time, and the 73 war happened. That was in October 6th. And at the time, all schools were closed. So I was older. I was 16 years old or something. So I really remember this. And it was all elementary schools, junior high, universities were closed, except for high school. So I remember going to school during the war, and you kind of hear what is happening. And it's just every day. The war is far away. It didn't affect us directly, our daily life, but it was still, Egypt was involved. It was very much involved.
Was there a difference in your experience living through the war in Lebanon and living through the wars in Egypt?
Probably yes. I was much younger in Lebanon, so my recollections of that is more like the effect on the students and the people that I saw. While in Egypt was involved in the war, was fighting actually, and I knew people who were in the war, who had been killed, etc. So it's a much more personal thing. I was there in the middle of it.
Did they affect your ability to go to school, to study? Did life just go on as normal because it was far from the war?
So as I mentioned, high schools were not affected. So my sister, who went to junior high at the time, she didn't go to school, but I continued to go. The 67 war had other effects, indirect, that I felt later on in my life, which was that a lot of the cities on the Suez Canal had to be evacuated. So Bursaid, Suez, and Ismailia had to be evacuated in the 67 war, and they remained evacuated and abandoned until after 73, so 75. And then I realized much later on that many of my friends in the university were actually, quote, refugees that had left Suez or Bursaid and had come to live and continue their life in Alexandria. And they have different traditions and stuff. So it added something to my life that I wasn't aware of at the time.
So you experienced, and as you mentioned, you experienced the very multicultural and cosmopolitan environment and populace in Lebanon. And then Egypt is not very homogeneous, but Egypt has not that many religions. Can you contrast your experiences observing the different religions interacting with each other in Lebanon and then also in Egypt?
So on the surface of it, things looked beautiful in Lebanon. I mean, there was diversity and everything. And then the civil war started in 75, and we were going in the summers from 71, 72 through 75. And then all hell broke loose. And later on in the 90s, I actually went back to Beirut and I saw the destruction and the horror of it. And that is something that one worries about. And and we are always afraid of this. We love diversity, but sometimes if there isn't enough of a balance in how everybody credits the different communities, it can cause problems and can cause death and destruction. And that's what unfortunately happened for a long time in Lebanon.
And in Egypt, were the relations between the Muslims and the Coptic Christians that you mentioned, were they healthy, or was there friction there?
So definitely at the time when I was a student, I felt it was things were good. I had some, like, we would be in a classroom and there was a mixture of Christians and Muslims, and you didn't feel any different, except when so in Egypt in school you have religion classes, and then the Christians go to one room and the Muslims go to another room. Things have gotten a lot more tense and problematic in more recent years. I think I'm hoping things will stabilize. There is a strong minority, but it is a big community in Egypt, and it's part of the community. We are mixed everywhere, whether in the south or the north. There isn't any geographic reason for.
So earlier you mentioned the entrance exam, the baccalaureate exam that everyone takes at the end of their high school. How did you prepare for that? Was there extra coaching classes that you took or other students took on the side, or was it just like the school curriculum that everyone studied?
So there was the school curriculum, and most students took what are called private lessons. Mm-hmm. I pride myself not to have taken private lessons. I decided I was going to study by myself. I didn't need private lessons, and we had the textbooks. The books were available. It was fine. So I could do it, and I did excel, and I succeeded in my exams. On this period, also, I should mention Egypt. Was at the time, it was the non-alignment movement time, yeah? So there were strong relationships. So this was Gamal Abdel Nasser was the leader of Egypt, and there was Nero in India, and there was Tito in Yugoslavia. And all of these, we kind of grew up in this kind of environment that was proud of being non-aligned. And I think I personally benefited from this non-alignment in that the various powers, so whether it's the Soviet Union or the US or the European, British, French, they had very strong cultural programs in Alexandria, I'm sure in Cairo too, but I felt it because it's a smaller city in Alexandria. So I would go to the Soviet Cultural Center, and they had cheap math books. Good Russian math books in English that were being sold for almost, very cheap, even by Egyptian standards. And I think that was very good. I also would go to the French Cultural Center, and I took very cheap, French classes. So I learned French as a result and had French connections, and they sent me to France to spend some time there. And so all this, I think, in retrospect, I think this was one advantage of the Cold War, is for countries like Egypt, we had all these superpowers trying to attract us, and as a result, we benefited. There was music, there was theater. Good musicians would come and play in Alexandria. It was always on the route.
Next up is MIT professor Fadel Adib. He grew up in Lebanon. And Fadel Adib spoke about being born in 1989 and the hope in Lebanon right after the civil war of the 1980s. He also spoke about him dropping everything to do humanitarian work during his high school years in the early to mid-2000s.
So I was born in Lebanon the same year the civil war ended. So we had a civil war for about 15 years right before I was born. And while growing up, my parents used to, one of the most common phrases that my parents and their generation used to tell us is, may you have beautiful days. And the reason why they used to say that is because they meant that we would have peaceful days, since they were just coming out of a war. It was a time of a lot of sort of happiness, of people were optimistic about the future, about rebuilding the country. I went to school in a village, which was outside of Tripoli. My parents decided to send us to that school. It was called International School because it was a very secular school. And so they wanted to, after a sectarian civil war between Muslims and Christians, they wanted me and my sister to go to a school that had fundamentally secular principles.
And so you described the time early in your childhood as being kind of a time of hope and renewal in the country right after the Civil War.
Right.
Did that last for a while as you were in school, or did that?
So when you grow up in Lebanon, it was hope, but there were also many setbacks. Like, I've lived through a few wars while growing up. I remember seeing very sort of heartbreaking footage on TV. I've lived through a couple of wars where I had to stop doing everything and just work on humanitarian aid. And sometimes whenever that happens, I have to do that again today, because at the end of the day, human lives are more important than anything. But there was still this feeling of optimism. It went on until I was about 15, but then we had a big assassination in the country. Of our prime minister was assassinated, and unfortunately, I don't think the country ever recovered from that, and it's been actually quite like there has been some level of unrest since then. But you live through it, and you want to live. Like, people, there's a saying in Lebanon that people will party even when like they're being bombed, because you want to live. We love life, and that is the way that you fight for yourself. It's by letting yourself live.
So the assassination you were referring to is Rafiq Hariri.
Right. The Rafiq Hariri assassination, I think around in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So you mentioned that when war happened or a humanitarian crisis happened, you had to essentially drop everything and do something for the humanitarian crisis. Can you give some experiences of yours?
Yeah. So, for example, in 2006, there was a war between Hezbollah and Israel, and we saw the images on like the TV. We saw the video footage, and there were like kids who had nothing that they could do in the south of Lebanon. I grew up in the north. That was in the south, and that it happened during the summer which was before my senior year of high school. I was supposed to be studying for my SATs back then. These are also important in Lebanon to be able to be admitted into undergrad. And they were also the year before my baccalaureate, where people usually start studying a year in advance for these major exams that we have to take. But of course, I couldn't do any of that. So I started studying right away. The war started, I think, in June or in July. I can't remember exactly. We had to put everything to the side, and I joined the Red Cross. And we started also creating connections with the United Nations for humanitarian aid. So we were in a city that was relatively far from where the war zone was, and so we would go around. We would collect money. We would go to the markets. We would tell people, look, we want to buy like tissue paper. We want to buy clothes. Just want to buy to the refugees who are moving from the south and coming here. And we did all of this fundraising. We were working with the UN. People would give it to us for free. And so then we would go and like sort of take it also to people and help them with their sort of being able to get back to their lives.
In October of this year, 2021, Lebanon was in the news when a large part of the country lost electric power. You might think that this is small news, perhaps just a blip. But as Fadl talks about it, power cuts have, for a while, been a way of life in Lebanon. I start by asking him about the political instability. Again, returning a bit to the political instability, which we talked about earlier, that of course was, at its peak when during your years in AUB 2007 to 2011, that was right after Rafiq Hariri's assassination in 2005. Did that have an effect on your life in the university and the life of your friends?
Yeah, of course. I think it was a very scary time. I remember in my first year or maybe first couple of years, every weekend there would be a bombing somewhere in the capital or in the larger capital where there was a instability. So you're afraid for your life, really, there. And then you're like, oh, the other thing about when these things happen is, do I know anyone who was impacted? Where did this happen? I heard this. Who was assassinated? All of these, and you're trying to study at the same time. So it was a bit crazy. And then also in May of 2008, there was also a lot of civil unrest in Beirut. We had to escape the city early around dawn to make it home. And then for 3 weeks, we had no college because we were like, what the hell is going to happen in the country? We were studying, but you had all of these sort of things that pull you away. I mean, the news, politics invades your life. When I came to the US for an internship, the first thing that I felt is, oh my goodness, politics is not invading my life. I can finally, for the first time, actually focus. Of course, when I speak to my family, I'm checking on them, but I am able to focus on doing work. So instead of trying to cram so much in 10% of the time, I have 100% of the time. I have 10 times more to be able to actually do work. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it is not. Earlier this year, I had to go back to Lebanon because my mother contracted a critical case of COVID. She was hospitalized, so we were concerned. It was a very stressful time, but I had to go and spend 2.5 weeks. And I realized why I used to feel that way. You lose electricity, and then you're waiting for a backup generator to come. When you lose the generator, you need to wait for the internet to come back up. You're literally for every 10 minutes, you can get 1 minute done, and it's very interrupted. So I think looking back, it was very hard, and it is still very hard. And there's all of these constraints that people don't realize. And so when I came to the US, the thing that I realized, being able to work continuously is such a privilege that I never had before, and that really helped me. Also, it's almost as if someone was fasting and suddenly they ate and they have all of that energy. And so for me, it's like it was constrained, and suddenly these constraints were removed, and I kept working almost at the same pace. And so I was able to do much more work than I was able to do in a more constrained environment.
I hope your mother recovered and is doing better.
Yeah, thankfully she recovered actually, and she arrived in the US on Mother's Day. So that was I had a very nice gift for Mother's Day this year.
Yes, a gift for both you and your mother. I think going back to the country of origin always is a very interesting experience because you get a culture shock because the country has moved a little bit, but then again you also get reminded of many of the reasons that made it very hard to work there. And in a sense, a lot of this is survival, right? The generator example you were giving is just basic day-to-day things that we take for granted living here in the US and in Canada. Did the instability during your years in AUB, did that have a role to play in your decision to migrate to the US, or was it largely just, I'm just interested in going to the best place?
I think probably in middle school, I wanted to look. I mean, the US is still the land of opportunities, despite what some people might say. I always felt that if you want to go to a place where you can grow, the US was such a big attraction. I think it still is. I mean, my students come from all types of backgrounds from within the US and around the world. And I wanted to do that. In fact, me staying in Lebanon, I mean, there was a great institution that I could go to, which was my undergraduate university, but I also wanted to afterwards be able to move and to actually be able to come to a top university in the US and work and do research.
Were your batchmates with you in AUB where did they go? Did many of them come to the US? Did they stay in industry in Lebanon or generally in Asia? What happened to them?
Most people in Lebanon immigrate in general. I think the statistics are like 50% of the people who are in my age group leave. They either go to like the Arab Gulf countries where there is much more opportunities to work, or they come to the US or to Europe, where one of the good things is that the education is actually pretty good. And so we're very well prepared to be able to do things, but also historically, people from that region always moved. I mean, they've always have moved around into it and out of it. It's a coastal country altogether, and when people are by the sea, they're always thinking about where do you want to go next.
It sounds like there is an itinerant or nomadic DNA or a gene in there somewhere. That 50% is a large number, and that must affect the country quite a bit too. Are there discussions in Lebanon of how to maybe stop this brain drain and keep people back, or is that?
When we were young and there was optimism, people used to talk about these things. I think there is very little, unfortunately, there is not much optimism now. So, I mean, it's also a very small country in general. So people in general move around. I mean, imagine that I'm in Massachusetts. Imagine that everybody who's is born in like Western or Eastern Massachusetts just stays in Eastern Massachusetts. It's just too small to be staying there. Even if people wanted to, a lot are going to move to other parts of the state or other parts of the country.
If you haven't already done so, please listen to the previous segments in the show. We covered Yugoslavia in episodes 1 through 4, Brazil in episodes 5 through 8, the Middle East in episodes 9 through 12, US Virgin Islands in episode 13, and China in episode 14, and several anonymous narrators featured in episode 15. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes from the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast as we visit other parts of the world. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists Podcast.